Today we're going to look at the Battle of Flodden between England and Scotland, fought on the 9th of September 1513. It was the last battle where a monarch of Great Britain fell in battle, and it was also the biggest battle ever to be held between the kingdoms of England and Scotland. So in 1513, the monarchs of Scotland and England were Henry VIII, famously, and James IV of Scotland. Now, perhaps contrary to popular perception, this actually involved an invasion of England by the King of Scotland. So this was fought in Northumberland, and it was fought on English soil. And it was part of the War of the League of Cambrai, which we'll talk a little bit more in a second. The Scottish army was led by James IV, King of Scotland. The English army was not led by Henry VIII, it was led by the Earl of Surrey. The Earl of Surrey being Thomas Howard, who perhaps confusingly was also the second Duke of Norfolk, as well as being the Earl of Surrey. Now, as a medieval historian, I often feel that the Battle of Flodden gets overlooked because we tend to look at, particularly in Britain, we tend to look at the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, and our study of medieval history often finishes at about 1485 or 1500. And then the later historians dealing with later periods, they tend to be looking more at the Elizabethan age, perhaps, you know, later on in Henry VIII's period, but Elizabethan age, English Civil War and things like this. So the Battle of Flodden occupies a very interesting period in history, which is, we could say, post-medieval, but really kind of quite early Renaissance by English or Scottish standards. So in 1513, we'll talk more about the military organisation and the armies as we go along. But you have to think about essentially a medieval army. Think about a late Wars of the Roses army. So we're talking about the military technology being used, the terms of the arms and the armour and the artillery, really not very different to the end of the Wars of the Roses, and quite early by Renaissance standards. Now, very briefly, by way of context, the War of the League of Cambrai was actually a series of conflicts, you could say a war, but a series of split up conflicts that happened across Europe between the 1490s, about 1494, all the way up to the 1550s. And it enveloped all of Europe, really. Everybody got involved, everyone got a piece of this conflict. The Papal States and the Holy Roman Empire were two of the main protagonists, also France, Switzerland, England and Scotland, as we see here, and the Italians as well. There were conflict within Italy, particularly Venice. And so this was a political war and to some extent religious war as well, that spread right the way across Europe. And as far as the Battle of Flodden is concerned, I think a lot of British people tend to gloss over this. This was part of a greater European conflict. And traditionally, Scotland, of course, being opposed to England for a lot of the medieval period, despite the fact that the monarchs were intermarried, had often been allied with France, and as we come into the era of Protestant versus Catholic, had for certain parts been allied more with the sort of Catholic countries, and the so-called Old Alliance as well, which is something which features all the way through to the Jacobite rebellions. So as a way of maintaining its independence, Scotland had often allied with France against England and had fought in the 100 Years' War on France's side in France against English armies. I should reiterate for this point, because modern politics unfortunately sometimes use the medieval and Renaissance eras to support their modern political arguments, bear in mind that this was, medieval wars and Renaissance wars were very often wars between dynasties, between rulers, and between religious factions. And in many cases, the rulers were interrelated. So the monarchs of England and the monarchs of Scotland were interrelated, and later on the monarchs of Scotland would become the monarchs of England, in fact. So don't think about this as necessarily like a football game, England versus Scotland. Think about this more about dynasties and political elites against each other. Now, actually, Scotland and England had come to a peace, the so-called Treaty of Perpetual Peace in 1502. Which, as it turns out, was not perpetual at all. It didn't last very long at all, as a result of various things. There were cross-border raids, there was piracy, there was capturing of resources and ships, and also the factor that we mustn't overlook, Henry VIII himself, who was very, very bellicose. He wanted to revive the 100 Years' War with France. He claimed kingship of France, he claimed kingship of Scotland, and he executed a hell of a lot of people in his reign as well. So Henry VIII was a complicating factor in European politics at this time, and certainly one of the main reasons why the conflict broke out with Scotland again. Now, ironically, considering that Henry VIII would later go on to break away from the papacy, from Rome, and establish the Church of England and become the head of the Church of England and a Protestant, at this point in history, Henry was a staunch defender of Catholicism and was actually fighting against the French on the side of the Papal States, on the side of the Pope. So he was part of an alliance who were fighting in Italy, on the side of the Pope, fighting against the French, and the French had been aggressors in Italy. The French had invaded Italy and taken Milan at one point. So Henry VIII was fighting against France on the side of the Pope at this point, as part of the Catholic League, and to honour their kind of old alliance, the Scots had agreed to basically annoy Henry VIII by invading the north of England and diverting forces away from his interests in France, diverting them to defending the north of England. So Henry VIII was mostly looking at France, and then James IV, as part of his alliance with France, invaded northern England. So in this case, despite all of the lovers of the movie Braveheart out there, in this case, you could say, yes, Henry VIII was bellicose, yes, he was fighting in France. However, in this specific case, this was a case of the King of Scotland, James IV, actually invading England. Now, without going any more into the extremely complicated politics of the period, and if you want to learn more about a period of history and you don't already know about this, I'd highly recommend this because it's an extremely interesting period of history. And if you like battles and warfare, there's a whole ton of it all over Europe, as we'll see now, that resulted in the Battle of Flodden. But we're just now going to look at the lead up to Flodden and what actually led to it. So the first thing that happened was essentially in August, a force of about 7,000 Scots, so-called border reivers as they were known, came across the English border and started raiding homesteads and farms and just generally pillaging around. Frankly, as was not uncommon across the English-Scottish border, and indeed the English-Welsh border, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And in fact, if you go all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you can see that the Anglo-Saxons and the Scots were doing this way back before the Norman conquest. So a tale as old as time, the border reivers came raiding across the border, but this time, remember, with a political motivation to do with the alliance with France, to try and attract some attention and draw some of England's forces north. So the Earl of Surrey was given the responsibility for dealing with this, and so he sent a Sir William Bulmer with a force of mounted archers. That doesn't mean like Mongols shooting from horseback, that purely means longbowmen, English longbowmen, sometimes Welsh as well, who rode on horses so they could travel quickly, get to the location, dismount, and then fight as archers on foot. So he sent a small force, I think of a couple of hundred mounted archers north, and on the way they picked up some militia and levied troops, such that they had a force of about 1,000 men. Now this relatively small force did actually manage to ambush the Scots, who by this point were returning towards Scottish territory with a whole load of pillaged goods, and in fact they basically routed them. They killed about 600 of them, and the rest of the Scots went off. They were probably already dispersed by this point already, so don't necessarily think about this as a great victory of 1,000 versus 7,000. It's likely that the approximately 7,000 Scots by this point were split into separate groups. But anyway, they managed to capture a lot of the stolen belongings, including banners and various other things, and kind of saw them off. So this was a precursor to James IV's main invasion force. So James IV on the 18th of August now started moving south with a force of artillery, 5 or 6 artillery, and then some more followed later. And Catherine of Aragon was Henry VIII's wife at this point, one of his 6 wives of course, and she was actually regent on the throne because Henry was abroad, he was in France. And so she actually, when she heard of this, she gave 2 important orders. One was for all of the property of all Scots in England to be seized, and secondly, for an army to be raised and to head north. Now, after mustering his troops for around a month, James IV eventually led his army of it's estimated around 42,000 men, which is absolutely colossal by late medieval or Renaissance standards. This is a massive army. Moreover, because it was a Scottish army, and you have to bear in mind that the population of Scotland has always been considerably lower than the population of England. It wasn't such a disparity in this period as it is now. In modern days, we're about 67 million in the whole of the UK, of which about 5 million, I think, are Scots. But the disparity wasn't so big in this period, it has to be pointed out. But nevertheless, 42,000 was a huge army with a whole bunch of artillery, various types of troops, of which pikemen, and we'll come back to that, pikemen were a very, very important element. And he crossed the River Tweed at the town of Coldstream, which incidentally gives the Coldstream Guards, one of the 4 regiments of foot guards of the modern reigning monarch, their name. They originate from Coldstream. So they crossed into English territory at Coldstream with an army of 42,000. So this happened right at the end of August, about the 22nd of August, and one part of the army broke off to attack Tweed Castle, while the bulk of the army continued moving on. So their priority at this stage seems to have been to besiege, take and ransack certain English castles. It's not totally clear whether they intended to simply ransack them or whether they intended to hold them and thereby push the Scottish border south. But either way, this was what they did. They attacked fortifications because, of course, these were major strong points. And also remember, in this period, when you take a fortification, often fortifications by this point had firearms, cannons in them, artillery of various kinds. When you take them, so long as the guns aren't spiked or ruined or blown up by the defenders, you're able to take those guns and add to your force. So even if your ultimate goal is to fight a pitched battle, by taking fortifications that have guns, you now have more guns. So James IV's army went on and they captured the castles of Norham, Ettal and Ford. In fact, Norham Castle was partially demolished, so this gives us some idea to James IV's battle plan. It was to basically ruin English castles in the north, not necessarily to hold them himself, but bear in mind, as I say, each time he takes one of those castles, he gains more hardware, in some cases better weapons for his troops, but most importantly, I imagine he would have been on the hunt for artillery, which in themselves, the more artillery you've got, make it quicker and more effective to take the next fortification. Now, during this period, there was an interesting little interlude of each side trying to decide what move to take next, balancing up where to deploy their forces, how long to keep their forces in the field, because of course they cost money and they were only expected, under certainly the Scottish army, under feudal agreements to stay in the field for a certain amount of time. There was also a consideration to besiege Berwick on Tweed. So there were various kind of debates about what to do next at this point. But there is an interesting little detail that happens. The Earl of Surrey, who was at Durham Cathedral at this time, actually received the banner of St Cuthbert, which had been carried against the Scots previously in war in 1138 and 1346. And I just find it mind-boggling to think that there's a banner. I mean, we all know the significance and importance and reverence which banners are held in, even by the modern military. But I find it amazing to think that they had a banner in 1513 that had been carried in war against the Scots so long ago, 1138 and 1346, assuming it was still the original banner of St Cuthbert. That, I think, is an amazing relic to be carrying at this time. Now, the Earl of Surrey's son was Thomas Howard, also called Thomas Howard, was the High Admiral of the fleet. So he was in charge of England's ships at this time. And there was a coordination between the Earl of Surrey's troops on land and the High Admiral's fleet at sea. And so the Earl of Surrey moved to Alnwick and there awaited the arrival of the fleet, who were very important to the whole war effort. So by September the 4th, James IV's Scottish army had essentially entrenched themselves, we'll talk more about that in a second, on Flodden Hill. Now, Flodden Hill itself is a very advantageous position to fight from, particularly if you're going to fight defensively or as an artillery position. There's been some debate over the years about whether James IV actually fortified the area. and certain people examining the battlefield, which you can still visit today, in past centuries, said that they observed earthworks which they assumed were from the Battle of Flodden in 1513. However, to complicate things, this part of the country has been subject to human interaction, shall we say, for hundreds and thousands of years, and there is actually Iron Age hill fort in this area. So it's unclear whether James IV actually fortified his position in terms of actually digging in, or whether he just brought things like gabions and other kind of movable fortifications and wooden stakes and things like that, or whether he just reused the lay of the land that was already there with the sort of remains of the Iron Age workings, the ramparts and ditches and stuff. We don't really know. But even if you take aside the fortification element, this is a very considerable hill that has steep slopes, and it has marshes around it as well. And also remember that, generally speaking, from medieval and Renaissance times to now, there's generally been a process of draining land so that we can use more farmland. Back then, more of the land would have been more sodden and more difficult to advance across, in some cases impossible to advance across with artillery or horses. So it was a very good defensible position. And also remember that an important element of James IV's army was his artillery. So placing yourself on top of a hill is fantastic. It gives you more range, and also gives you, literally, you're going to take out more people when you hit because of the trajectory of the balls. So you can shoot down onto an advancing enemy rather than just bouncing balls through or over them. September the 8th, the day before the battle. The Earl of Surrey, seeing how well defended James IV and his Scottish army were at the top of the hill, with his own army of around 26,000 Englishmen and probably Welshmen as well, decided instead to spend a day manoeuvring around the side of Flodden Hill. And so for the rest of the 8th of September, that's more or less what he did. Come the morning of September the 9th, the day of the battle, the English army was still trying to come around the flank of the Scottish position to essentially come from a direction they hadn't expected, from the side, and to take Branxton Hill, which was a position of, if not equal, of advantage, of the best that was on offer, essentially. However, the Scottish Army's scouts noticed the English approaching, and what they did is they came down off Flodden Hill and moved to Branxton Hill. So they basically got there before the English did, and the vanguard, the English vanguard, didn't get there in time and discovered the Scots arrayed on Branxton Hill, ready to fight. By this point, James IV's Scottish army had been diminished due to illness and people having to return to Scotland for various other reasons, so it's estimated they were around 34,000. The English army was around 26,000. So the Scottish army was still bigger. However, debatably, you could say by this point the English army had been in the field for less time. It had been supplied by the navy, and so it was probably better equipped and fresher than the Scottish army was. Now, the main part of the Scottish army was organised into 4 large units known as battles, and these were organised under different aristocratic commanders that were essentially had a sense of identity by their region that they were drawn from, so different parts of Scotland. Therefore, they might have been clothed and equipped and armoured slightly differently with different weapons. However, for most of the infantry, the predominant weapon was the pike. Now, the pike had long been a favoured weapon of the Scots in their schiltrons, going all the way back to the 14th century. These were the long spears that William Wallace and Robert the Bruce had equipped most of their infantry armies with. However, by this period, the pike had developed, and this was now an 18-foot long weapon, and allegedly the weapons at Flodden that the Scots were equipped with had been provided for them by their French allies. However, it should be pointed out, this wasn't a completely new weapon to them, and the Scots had been fighting with long spears and, we could say, pikes for hundreds of years by this point, a couple of hundred years. So it wasn't a new weapon to them, and their tactics were very well known. Now, contrary to popular perception, a lot of people think of pike blocks as quite static things to protect musketeers or artillery in later periods. However, the Scots famously used schiltrons or spear blocks, pike blocks, offensively as well, and they did charge with them, they did attack with them. So don't only think about these pike blocks as a static defensive thing, they were used offensively as well, just the same as people like Alexander the Great had done hundreds of years previously. In addition to the infantry armed primarily with pikes, and of course they would have had sidearms like this as well on their hips as backup weapons for when you get too close to use the pike, or when enemies are routing and this kind of thing. In addition to that, they also had quite a lot of artillery. So the Scots had invested heavily in artillery, and again the alliance with France had been an important part of this, and they'd actually drawn some of their artillery from places like Edinburgh Castle. So they had at least around 20 guns. They probably had far more than that, but the main heavy guns they had numbered around 20 in total, which by the standards of the day was a large number, and probably they had a number of smaller field pieces as well. Some of these guns, particularly the larger and heavier ones, would not have been very mobile, and once they were moved into position, they couldn't necessarily be moved around very much. They aim in the general direction of the enemy and blast away. Some of the smaller pieces, however, could be loaded with shot, could be loaded with smaller balls, smaller caliber, and they could be used more in a more targeted way to take out particularly tough spots of the opposing force. Now, the English army under Surrey was composed principally for most of the battle of 3 main battles or units, large units, and these were almost entirely infantry. There was a small cavalry contingent in the rear who were probably kept for scouting, for perhaps attacking artillery, and also for attacking routing enemies should that occur as well. So just generally as a reserve on horseback, and some of those incidentally were borderers as well. So don't always necessarily think about a strict black and white between Scottish and English here. Sometimes you'd find some Scots on the English side and some English on the Scots side. But there was also a 4th battle under Stanley, which didn't arrive until much later in the day. So it did play a part, and that involved cavalry and also archers. So that did play a part later on, but not initially in the battle. So most of the English infantry, just as they had been throughout the Wars of the Roses and all the way back into the 100 Years' War, were consisting of billmen, so that is soldiers equipped with a mail shirt, a sallet and a brigandine, sometimes elements of leg and arm plate armour. So fairly well armoured in many cases, at a minimum level a mail shirt, a brigandine and a sallet, so their torsos and heads being pretty well armoured, with a bill. The bill of course being the absolutely famous pole arm of the English that they had favoured right the way through the second half of the 100 Years' War, or certainly the later stages of the 100 Years' War, and all the way through the Wars of the Roses. And of course we know that the Mary Rose, which was Henry VIII's flagship that sunk in 1545, so 30 years after this, 32 years after this, contained lots of bills. So even in the 1540s, the bill was still absolutely the most common pole weapon, and most common weapon really, of English infantry. But of course, aside from the billmen, were the famous English longbowmen. We don't know the exact split, the exact proportion of archers to billmen, but there would have been a lot of archers in attendance, because English armies had always, or certainly for a long time, relied on large numbers of archers going all the way back into the 100 Years' War, and it was still the case in Henry VIII's reign, and it was still the case even as we see on the flagship, the Mary Rose. There were a lot of archers, a lot of longbows and a lot of arrows. So the English force, 3 main large units or battles, consisting almost entirely of billmen and longbowmen. In addition to which there was English artillery as well, with attending supply chain. We don't know an awful lot about the English guns, but it does seem that they were for the most part not the best, and they were not particularly large caliber, and some of them were probably quite old-fashioned. But there was English artillery in attendance, but probably less artillery on the English side than there was on the Scottish side, and rather smaller poundage of guns as well. Friday afternoon, the 9th of September 1513. The Battle of Flodden begins. The first stage of the battle commenced with an artillery duel. Scottish heavy guns versus smaller English guns. Now, there's much debate about what exactly happened here. There were certain English claims that English guns destroyed some of the Scottish guns, but the Scottish guns were later captured intact, so we don't know whether that's true. It could be that some of the English fire did damage the crews manning the guns, or indeed their supply of powder and things like this. It's possible that powder stores got hit and damaged. We don't know. But what does seem to be the case overall is that the Scottish artillery did not perform anywhere near as well as anyone, James IV or even the Earl of Surrey, expected the Scottish artillery to perform. One possible explanation is that they were shooting downhill, and that for some reason, something to do with the ground that they were prepared on or the way they were set up, they were just not able to target the English forces effectively. Possibly they were not seated properly, they were sliding around, who knows? There's many different theories. But what we do know is that the English guns somehow, against all odds, outperformed the Scottish guns. One other theory is that the English guns, being smaller and therefore having a faster rate of fire, simply targeting the gun crews, the Scottish gun crews, by keeping up a fairly high rate of fire, so disturbed the Scottish gun crews in their operation of their slow and heavier guns that they just weren't able to return fire enough to suppress the English fire. So it could be a case of English suppressing fire, outshooting with a higher rate of fire the Scottish fire coming back, despite the fact that on paper the Scottish guns were more powerful. The next thing which happened was the Scottish left flank, left battle, now advanced down the hill in good order, and it's remarked that they were very disciplined, not speaking, and also that they placed their most heavily armoured men in the front to mitigate the effect of the English archery against them. And this seems to have been so effective. We don't know obviously how many archers there were. This may have played a part because we know that Stanley's archers didn't arrive until later, so maybe there was a lack of firepower from the archers, a lack of arrows going the Scottish direction. But for whatever reason, either because of the armour or the lack of archers, or the nature of the hill, or the disciplined advance, the Scottish left came down into the English right and drove it back, so much so that the English in some cases started they got pushed back and then they started routing. In fact, they were saved by that. Do you remember that contingency little reserve of horsemen? They came around the side of the Scots, and somehow, again, it's difficult to interpret from the source material, somehow they forced a stalemate. Maybe they did a quick sort of hit and run on the Scottish flanks. Maybe they simply threatened to do so. But either way, what ensued was a standoff between the Scottish left and the English right. The English had been driven back, but the rescue, essentially, the cavalry coming to the rescue, somehow managed to result in a stalemate. This, incidentally, is a great example of one of the uses of cavalry, because cavalry are able to move very quickly across the battlefield. So even if in hand-to-hand combat the cavalry themselves might not be very potent against a pike block, the fact is that cavalry are able to get somewhere quickly, to respond very quickly, and then get somewhere else quickly as well. So they're able to move around. And, of course, to a pike block, who are pikes down presented against an enemy formation here. Yes, they could have formed a square, but if they form a square, they now reduce their fighting effectiveness at the front. So pike blocks are vulnerable to the threat of cavalry from the side or to the rear, because it reduces their forward fighting capacity. And, of course, the cavalry, much like the bayonet in World War I, it doesn't need to be used to be effective. It's the threat of it being used that can sometimes be most effective. Now, the next stage that happened is actually extremely interesting for people who are interested in weapons and their individual use, but also, of course, in their group use. And it's very specific to pikes. So pikes, to operate well, have to be used in a very disciplined way with group cohesion and coordination. And as a result, we see in the 16th and 17th centuries pike drill manuals. This is not something that we see for bills or halberds prior to this. We see individual treatises for the use of bills or halberds, but we don't see them in group use treatises, which we do see pikes used for. Now, what happened is the next Scottish battle or unit to come down to engage the English came down the middle and essentially encountered an area of boggy ground. Modern examinations have shown that this area, as you often get at the bottom of a hill, is very susceptible to this, but particularly here it must have been a low point. This may incidentally also have played because there had been a lot of rain leading up to the battle, as is common in that part of England, and it is possible this played a part on the artillery fire as well. It's possible that the Scottish artillery shooting downwards, that their balls were just going splat into the ground. We know this was a factor, for example, 3 centuries later, at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where the French artillery arguably underperformed because of the wet, sticky mud ground, where the cannonballs had not been having the effect that Napoleon would have liked. Anyway, back to Flodden. And so this unit of pikemen come down the hill with ideas of glory and being able to push the English back like we'd just seen. And it didn't happen because the Scots unit essentially broke apart to get through and across and around this muddy ground. Now, there are some sources that suggest that some Scots even abandoned their pikes to get out of this swamp, essentially, to get at the English, and essentially dropping their pikes and pulling out their hand weapons, swords and axes and large knives and things instead. Robbed them, number one, of their unit cohesion. They're now broken apart and essentially a rabble, but also it robbed them of their major weapon, of their main weapon. And so what happened was they crashed into the English lines eventually, and the English billmen made mincemeat of them. They probably didn't hit the English lines at the same time in a coordinated fashion, and some of them weren't using their pikes, or even if they had their pikes, they weren't using them in the cohesive way that pikes are intended to be used. And so, to cut a long story short, the English completely outmatched them in hand-to-hand combat, probably because they'd just been sitting there and waiting, keeping their unit close together and waiting for essentially the now disorganised unit of Scots to arrive. Now, unfortunately for James IV, he made a terrible decision at this point. We don't know whether it was because he was trying to bolster up what had just happened to the disorganised unit that had just gone in and engaged the English, or that he just hadn't seen what had happened to them yet, or that he was so close behind that it was too late to pull back and do something different. But essentially he followed in and engaged the Earl of Surrey's own unit or battle, and it didn't go well for him. James IV, hats off to him, fought from the front, but he engaged the Earl of Surrey's unit, and his unit encountered the exact same problems that the previous one had done, and had to get through this marshy ground and became completely disorganised and disarrayed in going through it. So by the time it met the Earl of Surrey's unit, it wasn't in the best shape at all. Despite that, they did manage to fight their way to the Earl of Surrey's own bodyguard. Nevertheless, the English fought them to a standstill, fought back, and essentially tore them to pieces. Now, if you've been counting the units or battles here, you will remember there is one more Scottish unit up on the hill. But around this time, Stanley turned up with his force of mixed archers and cavalry and probably billmen as well, normal infantry. And he deployed the archers. And I get the impression from how things panned out that actually he probably had the largest body of archers. Anyway, his archers opened up on the remaining Scots unit on the hill, and as it happens, that unit was made up mostly of Highlanders who were not armoured, and it didn't go well for them. They got absolutely shot to pieces, and of course fled. Now, obviously, the timelines of all of these things happening, it's difficult to disentangle from the historical sources, which have contradiction and, of course, bias in them. It does seem, however, that James IV did fight on and was probably one of the last people to go down, as he was protected by his personal bodyguard and also equipped in the finest armour of the day, which would have been imported. And it is also noted he had several wounds. He was wounded by 2 arrows. So presumably he was wounded on the way in before even engaging a hand-to-hand combat. And that's very, very important note when we talk about other battles like Agincourt and everything else. If you've been even slightly wounded by a couple of arrows in gaps between plates, in articulations and things like this, or, armpit or inside of the elbow, bend of the elbow and places like this, then it's going to massively reduce your fighting ability. Now, that's just one person. If you magnify that to a whole fighting force, if they've been peppered and even just slightly wounded by arrows on the way in, they are not going to be in great fighting condition by the time they get into hand-to-hand combat. Additionally, he was also wounded in the jaw, and elsewhere as well. So his armour was, despite the fact it was very good and it protected him very well, he was wounded by polearms, he was wounded by arrows, and ultimately he went down fighting as the last monarch in Great Britain to die in combat. So to conclude, there's been a lot written over the years by many different historians and military history experts about the Battle of Flodden, why it panned out the way it did. There's many things we don't know and are based on supposition, based on limited source material, and in some cases based on flawed understandings of how some of the weapons work. Many people have described Flodden as a victory of the bill over the pike, which I think is complete rubbish, because ultimately history showed that the pike had been a weapon around a long time, hundreds of years before the bill existed, and would remain in use right the way through the 17th century, and in fact even into the 18th century in places, and to be replaced by the bayonet ultimately. But the pike overall, I think, was a more important weapon in European warfare than the bill was. However, in specific scenarios, the bill could outperform the pike, and this was one of those. My view is there are three principal reasons why the Scottish army lost so badly at the Battle of Flodden, and it was a total crushing defeat. There's no way about it. You know, when you lose all of your army and you during an invasion as well, you lose all of your army, or nearly all of your commanders and your king. That is a terrible battle. That went incredibly badly for James IV's whole endeavour, really. But the three main reasons. Number one is land. So many victories and defeats come down to the land, and it is very clear here that the pike blocks were not used in the correct place and way. You know, it's a bit like if we look at how in certain modern war zones T-72 tanks have been used. It's not that there's necessarily anything wrong with a tank, it's that they've been used in the wrong way without infantry support. Same thing here. The pike blocks were used on muddy, marshy ground moving down a hill where they became completely bogged down and disordered. This isn't how a pike block works. That's not what to do with a pike block. They should have stayed where they were, used the hill, fought defensively, and kept shooting at the English. But here's where we come on to the second point. The second point is the artillery. It's clear that something went terribly wrong with the Scottish artillery. On paper, you would have put your money on the Scottish artillery kind of dominating this battle. For some reason they didn't. My personal pet theory, based on what I've read about this battle so far, is that it has something to do with the muddy ground, the same factor as the pikes, essentially. And if we look at other battles throughout history, for example Waterloo, we see that very muddy, boggy ground and inclinations, ups and downs in the ground, hills, can really mess with artillery at this time. The ideal for a cannonball is to bounce across ground and wipe out enemy infantry. If you are shooting downwards or you're shooting upwards, this messes with this theory, but equally if the ground is muddy, it exponentially messes with it. If you are shooting downwards into muddy ground, your cannonball goes splat and doesn't travel anywhere and doesn't do any real damage. So even if you were using shot, this has a reduced effect as well, but particularly with solid cannonballs as used at this time predominantly, this is a major problem. Ironically, shooting upwards, the English might have avoided the problem of the mud because they are shooting upwards and they're less likely to bury in the hill while shooting upwards. They're more likely to shoot over the hill, in fact. So if the English were shooting upwards, they're more likely to hit and damage targets. The Scottish are less likely to hit and damage targets shooting downwards into the mud. And the third factor connected, the third most important factor connected to these two things was the use of the land in terms of coming down the hill. I think the moment that James IV decided to charge down the hill with his infantry units, possibly in an uncoordinated fashion as well, he gave up his major advantage. His major advantage was height, pike blocks, and artillery. And all of those things were ruined when he decided to charge down the hill and fight the English on their own terms. A fourth and less important feature, I believe, is the fact that the Scots like to fight with their commanders at the front. James IV fought at the front. Most armies in Europe by this date, by the early 1500s, did not put their kings and commanders at the very front. However, the English actually at this battle did. Thomas Howard, the son of the Earl of Surrey, who was the Lord High Admiral of England, he did actually dismount and lead his troops on foot, according to English sources anyway. There's no reason to believe that that didn't happen. And there were all sorts of, rolled up in this period, there were all sorts of challenges to people's manliness and chivalry, and there were offers of trial by combat. And, you know, there's an implication that due to various insults that have been issued, that he actually did this as an act of bravado. So I don't want to say that it was normal, but there was a disparity that the Scots commanders seemed to have led from the front, the English seemed to have led from the rear mostly, as they would do in later centuries. But in this specific case, we do have a good example of an English commander leading his unit from the front. So overall, I would say in the case of the Battle of Flodden, 1513, September the 9th, you should remember that date because it's a really important battle actually, and very significant, very huge numbers. But I think overall this was an English victory because the Scots army was probably not, in some regards, not as professional as the English army. I think the English army was probably better equipped overall, better armoured overall. It had also been in the field for less time and was less worn out, and it was fighting on home ground with open channels of supply everywhere. But the Scottish army did have better artillery, it did have these newfangled pike blocks, even though, as I hope I've demonstrated, they weren't completely new to the Scots, but nevertheless they were fighting in the latest fashion with pike blocks. But English archers, again, I don't think we should underestimate the effect of English archers. And although it's difficult to say how many English archers were involved in the Battle of Flodden, we know that they were present, and certainly once Stanley turned up, it does seem that English archers, even up until that point, they hadn't necessarily played a big effect on the battle. After Stanley's archers arrived, it seems they did at that point play a very significant point on the battle. They completely decimated and got rid of one unit and made it flee that hadn't been committed yet. And we do know that James IV had a couple of arrow wounds, so his unit must have been being shot at as well. So English archers, even at this date, even when artillery is a big thing, English archers still super important and would continue to be later in the 16th century as well. I hope you've enjoyed watching this. I know these accounts are long. Is there a battle that you'd like me to look at in the future? I've been feeling for a while that the Battle of Flodden is rather neglected by modern YouTube historians like me, and just in general actually. It's not widely known about, and I think it should be better known. Are there other battles you'd like me to look at? I'm thinking about making this into a playlist. Let me know in the comments down below. Give me a thumbs up if you've enjoyed listening, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel soon. Cheers, folks.